These seats are for premium passengers only.
Victoria Ashford's voice sliced through the bustling chaos of Gate C-14 at Miami International Airport like a blade through silk. Her words carried the kind of polished cruelty that only comes from years of practice, each syllable delivered with the precision of someone who has never doubted her place in the world. She stood there in her tailored navy Chanel blazer, platinum blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her cold blue eyes, framed by designer glasses, assessed the Rodriguez family standing before her with the kind of clinical disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of an expensive shoe. At 34, Victoria embodied everything corporate America wanted you to believe success looked like. Designer heels that clicked with authority against the marble floor, pearl earrings that caught the harsh terminal lighting just right, a figure that she maintained through personal trainers and perfectly tailored clothing that whispered wealth with every movement. She was Senior Customer Relations Director for Atlantic Airways, and in her mind, that title gave her the right to decide who belonged where. What Victoria didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged, carefully curated life. Standing in front of her was Miguel Rodriguez, 42 years old, wearing faded jeans, a simple polo shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. His wife Carmen, 38, held their boarding passes with hands that trembled slightly not from fear, but from the familiar sting of recognition. This wasn't their first encounter with this particular brand of discrimination. Their daughter, Sophia, 11, clutched a small pink backpack and looked around with wide, curious eyes that hadn't yet learned to expect the worst from strangers. Their son, Diego, 16, already had his phone in his hand, his finger hovering over the record button with the instinct of a generation that had learned to document everything. Miguel's appearance was deliberately unremarkable. There was nothing about his casual clothes or quiet demeanor that would suggest he was anything more than another passenger trying to board a plane. But hidden in his carry-on bag was a Department of Defense contractor badge that gave him direct oversight authority over Atlantic Airways' entire federal security protocol. In his phone was a contact list that included admirals, senators, and Pentagon officials. And in his chest was a Navy Cross that he had earned by carrying 12 wounded soldiers through 2 miles of enemy fire in the mountains of Afghanistan. But Victoria Ashford saw none of that. All she saw was a man who didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in first class. "Ma'am," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled calm that came from years of training in situations far more dangerous than an airport gate. "We have our boarding passes right here." Carmen stepped forward, offering a warm smile that she hoped might diffuse whatever was about to happen. She held out 4 boarding passes, the paper slightly wrinkled from her nervous grip. "Good morning. We're seats 3A through 3D. Victoria didn't return the smile. Instead, her gaze flicked from Carmen's face to the tickets, then back to the family, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed suspicion. "I'm going to need to verify these boarding passes," she said, her tone implying that they were holding stolen property. "Before we see how this confrontation unfolds in all its devastating detail, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that every hero deserves respect, regardless of how they're dressed or what they look like, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because in exactly 18 minutes, this gate agent's prejudice is about to collide with military honor in the most spectacular way possible. What's about to happen will be captured on multiple cameras shared millions of times and become a case study in how quickly arrogance can destroy a career. This is the story of Master Chief Miguel Rodriguez, a man who saved lives on foreign battlefields and never asked for recognition. A man who built a multi-million-dollar business and never flaunted his wealth. a man who carried the weight of his service with quiet dignity and never expected special treatment. And this is the story of Victoria Ashford, a woman who mistook appearance for character, position for power, and prejudice for policy. The digital clock above the gate read 10:42 a.m. Flight 447 to Washington, D.C. was scheduled to depart at 11:15. In the next 18 minutes, everything about both of their lives was about to change forever. Miguel looked at his wife, saw the familiar tension in her shoulders, and felt the old familiar weight settle in his chest. How many times had they been here before? How many times had they been questioned, doubted, made to prove they belonged in spaces that their money had rightfully purchased? But this time was different. This time, Miguel wasn't just another passenger being profiled. This time he had the power to do something about it. He just didn't know if he wanted to use it yet. The terminal hummed with the usual chaos of international travel. Announcements echoed in multiple languages. Children cried. Adults rushed past with rolling luggage and stressed expressions. But at gate C-14, a small drama was beginning to unfold that would soon capture the attention of millions. Victoria Ashford adjusted her blazer and prepared to demonstrate exactly why she had been promoted to senior director at such a young age. In her mind, this was going to be simple. A few pointed questions, a show of authority, and these people would slink back to economy where they belonged. What she didn't realize was that she was about to go viral for all the wrong reasons. And what Miguel didn't realize was that after years of enduring discrimination and silence, he was about to find his voice in the most public way possible. The collision was inevitable. The consequences would be extraordinary. 4 hours earlier at 6:30 a.m., the Rodriguez household in Coral Gables had been a symphony of organized chaos. Carmen moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of family logistics, packing snacks and checking passports, while Sofia searched for her favorite travel pillow and Diego grumbled about the early departure time. Miguel sat at the kitchen table staring at his coffee with the distant expression that Carmen had learned to recognize over their 15 years of marriage. It was the look he got when his mind traveled to places she couldn't follow, to memories that he kept locked away in the deepest corners of his heart. Today was November 15th, the anniversary of the day that had earned him a Navy Cross and cost him 2 friends. The day that Captain James Mitchell had nearly died in his arms while enemy fire rained down around them in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. The day that had ended Miguel's military career and begun his long, difficult journey back to civilian life. For years, Miguel had spent this day alone in his garage workshop pretending to fix things that weren't broken while wrestling with memories that would never fade. But Carmen had decided that this year would be different. This year, they would reclaim the date. They would create new memories to balance the old pain. "Papa, are you okay?" Sofia asked, sliding into the chair next to him with the kind of intuitive concern that children possess. Miguel smiled and wrapped his arm around his daughter. "I'm perfect, mija. Just thinking about our trip." What Sofia didn't know, what none of his family knew, was the full extent of what Miguel had built since leaving the Navy. They knew he worked in security consulting. They knew he traveled occasionally for business. But they didn't know that AeroShield Defense Contractors, the company he had founded with 3 other former SEALs, was now one of the primary security training providers for major airlines. They didn't know that the quiet, modest man who worried about spending money on first-class tickets was worth $47 million. They didn't know that the phone calls he sometimes took in the garage weren't just work calls. They were briefings from Pentagon officials, consultations with airline executives, and coordination meetings with federal security agencies. Miguel had deliberately kept his success quiet. He had seen what money did to people, how it changed relationships and created expectations. He wanted his children to understand the value of hard work, to appreciate what they had without taking it for granted. He wanted Carmen to love him for who he was, not what he owned. But there was another reason for his secrecy, one that he barely admitted to himself. Deep down, Miguel still didn't believe he deserved the success. The memory of the two men who hadn't made it home still haunted him. Some nights he wondered if he was living the life they should have had. Carmen knew her husband carried wounds that went deeper than the shrapnel scars on his left leg. She had learned to read his silences to understand the way he sometimes stared out windows as if watching for threats that weren't there. She had researched PTSD, attended support groups for military spouses, and slowly, patiently helped him find his way back to the world. This trip was her gift to him. Months of secretly saving money, taking extra shifts at the children's hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse, cutting corners wherever she could. She had managed to save enough for 4 first-class tickets to Washington, D.C., where they would visit the memorials and help Miguel find peace with his past. The drive to Miami International Airport took 45 minutes through typical South Florida traffic. Diego sat in the back seat editing a video for his YouTube channel on his phone. At 16, he was part of a generation that documented everything that believed every moment was worth capturing and sharing. He had started the channel to showcase his filmmaking skills, hoping to build a portfolio for college applications. He had no idea that in a few hours his quick reflexes with a camera would create one of the most viral videos of the year. Sophia was reading a book about the Washington Monument, excited about seeing the city she had only experienced through pictures. Carmen was reviewing their itinerary, making sure they had reservations at all the restaurants and museums on their list. Miguel was running through security protocols in his mind, a habit he couldn't break. As they approached the airport, he automatically noted the number of police vehicles, the placement of security checkpoints, the flow of pedestrian traffic. His eyes swept the terminal entrance, cataloging faces and behaviors with the precision of someone who had been trained to spot danger. What he couldn't have predicted was that the danger would come from the very airline he helped train to prevent it. At the TSA security checkpoint, Miguel's name triggered the usual random additional screening. It happened every time he flew, a consequence of his military background and security clearance. Diego rolled his eyes with practiced frustration. "Again, Dad? Seriously?" "It's fine, son," Miguel said quietly, stepping into the scanning machine with practiced resignation. He raised his arms and mentally detached the way he had learned to do during the pat-downs, the additional questions, the suspicious looks that followed him through airport after airport. The TSA agent was professional but thorough, swabbing Miguel's hands for explosive residue, searching through his carry-on with meticulous attention. When they found his contractor identification hidden in a small pouch, the agent's demeanor changed slightly. "Aeroshield Defense," the agent read. "You work with the airlines. Security consulting?" Miguel replied simply. The agent nodded with newfound respect and waved them through. Carmen squeezed Miguel's arm as they collected their belongings, a small gesture of support that meant more than words. As they rode the train to Concourse C, Miguel felt the familiar anxiety that airports always triggered. The crowds, the noise, the constant movement, it all reminded him too much of other places, other times. But he breathed deeply and focused on his family's excitement. Carmen was practically glowing with anticipation. She had planned this trip down to the smallest detail, and seeing her happiness was worth any discomfort he might feel. They found gate C14 with 20 minutes to spare before boarding began. The gate area was already filling up with passengers, and Miguel automatically began his usual observation routine. He noted the positioning of airline staff, the layout of the seating area, the exits, and potential choke points. His gaze settled on the woman behind the gate counter, and something in his gut tightened. He had learned to trust his instincts, and something about her demeanor set off warning bells. Victoria Ashford was typing with aggressive intensity, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the keyboard like tiny hammers. When an elderly couple approached with a question about their seating, she barely looked up. Her response clipped and dismissive. Miguel filed the observation away and settled in to wait for boarding. In 15 minutes, they would line up for first class. In 18 minutes, his family's peaceful vacation would turn into a national news story. And in ways he couldn't yet imagine, this confrontation would finally give him a chance to use his voice for justice, instead of just carrying its weight in silence. Victoria Ashford's Hermes watch read exactly 9:47 a.m. when her carefully constructed morning began to crumble. She sat behind the gleaming gate counter at C14, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested someone was about to pay for her series of disappointments. The day had started badly and gotten progressively worse. Her alarm had failed to go off because her phone had died overnight, a consequence of staying up until 2 a.m. arguing with her investment banker boyfriend Tristan, who had chosen their 5-year relationship anniversary to inform her that he was reassessing his priorities and needed space to grow. The breakup itself wasn't particularly devastating. Victoria had sensed it coming for weeks, but the timing was humiliating. She had already booked a table at the exclusive Setai restaurant for dinner, had mentioned the anniversary to her colleagues, had even bought a new Versace dress that now hung in her closet like a monument to rejection. Then there was the coffee incident. Her usual triple-shot oat milk latte had ended up splashed across her pristine white theory blouse when a clumsy barista had stumbled. The replacement outfit, a navy Chanel blazer she had been saving for next week's board presentation, was beautiful but felt like wearing your best jewelry to a funeral. But the final straw had been the 9:30 a.m. call from her supervisor, regional director Marcus Davenport. He had summoned her to a video conference that began with the dreaded phrase, "We need to discuss your department's performance metrics." For 20 excruciating minutes, Davenport had dissected every aspect of her gate operations team. Customer satisfaction scores were down. Complaint reports were up. There had been 3 formal discrimination allegations filed against her staff in the past 6 months, all of which had been quietly settled by the legal department. Victoria Davenport had set his face filling the screen with bureaucratic disappointment. Atlantic Airways is facing increased scrutiny about our customer service practices. The Department of Transportation is breathing down our necks about equity and inclusion. I need you to understand that your position as senior director comes with expectations. The conversation had ended with an implicit but unmistakable threat: fix the problems or find a new job. Victoria had built her entire identity around being untouchable. She was Ivy League-educated Brown University magna cum laude, with a master's degree in business administration that her father's connections had helped secure. She was from the kind of old Connecticut money that opened doors before you even knocked. She was beautiful in the way that magazines promised success would make you beautiful: polished, refined, expertly maintained. At 29, she had become the youngest senior director in Atlantic Airways history, a promotion that had less to do with her competence and more to do with her family's investment in the airline industry. Her grandfather sat on the board of 3 major aviation companies. Her mother was a major shareholder in Atlantic Airways' parent corporation. Victoria had been groomed for leadership the way other people were groomed for pet shows. But underneath the designer clothes and family connections, Victoria harbored a deep insecurity that manifested as prejudice. She had learned early that maintaining her position required keeping others in theirs. She had perfected the art of subtle discrimination: the skeptical glance, the unnecessary verification request, the tone of voice that made people feel small without giving them grounds for complaint. Her gate area was her kingdom, and she ruled it with the kind of benevolent tyranny that kept most passengers compliant. She could make your boarding process smooth or miserable with a simple change in attitude. She could upgrade your seat or ensure you were placed next to a crying baby. She wielded these small powers with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. The irony was that Victoria actually believed she was good at her job. In her mind, she was protecting the airline's premium experience by ensuring that first class remained exclusive. She saw herself as a guardian of standards, a protector of the natural order that kept people in their proper places. What she didn't realize was that her definition of proper places was about to collide with someone who had earned his place through courage rather than inheritance. At 10:30 a.m., her subordinate Sarah Davidson approached the counter with obvious nervousness. Sarah was 26, a first-generation college graduate whose parents had immigrated from El Salvador. She worked 2 jobs to pay off her student loans and lived with 3 roommates in a studio apartment in Hialeah. Victoria. Sarah said carefully, "I've been reviewing the passenger manifest for Flight 447, and I wanted to ask about the seating protocol for Sarah." Victoria interrupted without looking up from her screen. "I don't have time for training questions right now. Handle whatever it is yourself." Sarah hesitated, then tried again. "It's just that we've had some complaints lately about passenger profiling, and I wanted to make sure we're following the updated guidelines." "The guidelines," Victoria said, finally looking up with ice in her voice, "are to ensure that our premium passengers receive the service they expect. If someone doesn't look like they belong in first class, it's our job to verify that they actually do. That's not profiling, Sarah. That's quality control." Sarah's face flushed, but she nodded and retreated to her station. She had learned not to push back too hard against Victoria's instructions. Jobs in airport management were competitive, and Victoria had made it clear that questioning her authority was a fast track to unemployment. As the morning wore on, Victoria's mood continued to sour. A delayed inbound flight from Boston had disrupted her gate schedule. A passenger had complained loudly about the lack of charging stations in the boarding area. Her coffee had gone cold while she dealt with a group of college students whose spring break trip had been canceled due to weather in Cancun. By the time Flight 447's boarding time approached, Victoria was primed for confrontation. She needed someone to take the blame for her terrible day, someone to remind her that she still had power in at least one corner of the world. At 10:40 a.m., she spotted the Rodriguez family approaching the gate area. Even from a distance, something about them triggered her carefully calibrated prejudice sensors. They looked happy, relaxed, completely comfortable in the premium boarding area. In Victoria's experience, people who belonged in first class carried themselves with a certain entitled confidence. They expected good service because they had always received it. These people looked grateful just to be there. Miguel Rodriguez wore clothes that probably came from Target. Carmen's purse was nice, but not designer. The children seemed excited rather than bored, as if flying first class was a special treat rather than a normal expectation. Victoria's gaze lingered on Miguel, taking in his casual appearance and quiet demeanor. Something about him set off every alarm bell in her prejudiced mind. He looked like someone trying to fly above his station, someone who didn't understand that certain spaces weren't meant for certain people. She checked her computer screen, confirming that seats 3A through 3D were indeed assigned to the Rodriguez family. The tickets had been purchased 3 months ago with a valid credit card. Everything was in order. But Victoria had learned that in order and appropriate weren't always the same thing. She adjusted her blazer, checked her reflection in her phone screen, and prepared to do what she believed was her job, protecting first class from people who didn't belong there. What she was actually about to do was destroy her career in front of millions of witnesses. The announcement crackled through the gate area with practiced cheerfulness. "Good morning, passengers. Atlantic Airways Flight 447 to Washington, D.C. is now ready for boarding. We invite our first-class passengers and Atlantic Elite members to board at this time." Carmen Rodriguez felt a flutter of excitement in her chest as she gathered her purse and carry-on. After months of planning and saving the moment had finally arrived. She looked at her family. Miguel adjusting his simple black carry-on. Sophia bouncing with barely contained enthusiasm, Diego already reaching for his phone to document the experience, and felt a surge of pride and anticipation. "Come on, everyone," she said softly, her voice warm with happiness. "This is our time." They joined the small line of first-class passengers, their boarding passes clutched in Carmen's hand like precious documents. Behind them, the economy passengers watched with the mixture of envy and resignation that had become as much a part of air travel as security lines and overpriced coffee. Miguel positioned himself slightly behind his family, his eyes automatically scanning the area with habits ingrained by years of training. He noticed the positioning of the airline staff, the flow of passenger traffic, the location of security personnel. Even on vacation, even surrounded by civilians, he couldn't completely turn off the part of his brain that assessed threats and escape routes. But as they approached the gate counter, the threat he should have been watching for was standing directly in front of him. Victoria Ashford had been observing their approach for several minutes, and with each step the family took closer to her domain, her suspicion and disdain had crystallized into action. She stood behind the counter like a sentinel, her posture perfect, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed hostility. When the family reached the front of the line, Victoria didn't move to scan their boarding passes. Instead, she let them stand there for several long seconds while she continued typing on her computer, each keystroke deliberate and dismissive. Carmen cleared her throat politely. "Good morning," she said, offering the warm smile that had gotten her family through countless difficult situations. "We're ready to board." Victoria finally looked up, and the temperature at gate C14 seemed to drop several degrees. "These seats are for premium passengers only," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of polished authority that had been refined through years of private school education and corporate training. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Carmen blinked, momentarily confused by the hostility where she had expected routine courtesy. "I'm sorry," Carmen said, her smile faltering slightly. "I don't understand." "Your boarding passes," Victoria said, extending one perfectly manicured hand. "I'll need to verify them." There was something in her tone that made Miguel step forward slightly, moving into a position where he could better see Victoria's face and body language. His instincts were screaming at him now, recognizing the signs of someone looking for a confrontation. "Of course," Carmen said, still trying to maintain her cheerful demeanor. She handed over the 4 boarding passes, the paper slightly wrinkled from her nervous grip. "We're seats 3A through 3D. Victoria took the passes with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she was doing them an enormous favor. She examined each one with theatrical skepticism, holding them up to the light, as if checking for forgeries, running her finger over the printing as if feeling for irregularities. "These are very expensive seats," she said finally, her voice loud enough to carry to the other passengers in line behind them. "Are you sure you didn't mean economy plus?" The question hit Carmen like a slap. Around them, other passengers began to take notice of the exchange. Some pulled out their phones, not yet recording, but ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. "No," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge that made Victoria look at him directly for the first time. "We meant first class. Those are our seats." Victoria assessed Miguel with the kind of clinical evaluation she might give to a suspicious package. She saw his worn sneakers, his faded jeans, his simple polo shirt. She saw a man who looked like he couldn't afford a business class upgrade, much less first-class tickets. "Sir," she said, her tone shifting to the kind of patronizing patience usually reserved for confused children, "I need to verify the credit card used to purchase these tickets. We have policies about fraudulent bookings." The word fraudulent cut through the air like a blade. Sophia looked up at her father with wide, confused eyes, not understanding why the pretty lady was being so mean to them. Diego's hand moved instinctively toward his phone. Miguel felt the familiar weight settling on his chest, the weight of every time he'd been followed through a store, every time he'd been asked for additional identification at hotels, every time someone had assumed the worst about him based on nothing more than his appearance. But this time was different. This time he had the power to fight back. "Ma'am," Miguel said, his voice still controlled but carrying an undertone that Victoria should have recognized as a warning, "these tickets were purchased legally with a valid credit card. We have confirmation numbers. We've received boarding passes. Everything is in order." "That's what I'm trying to verify." Victoria replied, turning to her computer screen with exaggerated efficiency. I'll need to see the credit card and a photo ID for the cardholder. Carmen fumbled in her purse for their identification, her hands shaking slightly with a mixture of humiliation and anger. She had worked so hard to make this trip special, had saved for months to give her family this experience. Now this woman was treating them like criminals. Here, Carmen said, handing over their IDs and the credit card she had used for the purchase. Victoria examined the documents with the same theatrical skepticism she had shown the boarding passes. She compared the names, checked the photos, and then turned back to her computer screen. I'm going to need to call this in, she announced, reaching for her desk phone. Call what? Miguel asked, and for the first time his military bearing became visible. His shoulders straightened, his posture shifted, and something in his voice made Victoria pause with the phone halfway to her ear. I need to verify these seats weren't purchased fraudulently, Victoria said, but her voice carried less certainty than before. Ma'am, Miguel said, stepping forward slightly. Before you make that call, I suggest you consider very carefully what you're about to do. There was something in his tone that made the hair on Victoria's arms stand up. This wasn't the voice of someone who could be intimidated or dismissed. This was the voice of someone who had faced down real danger and emerged victorious. Are you threatening me? Victoria asked, but her voice betrayed a tremor of uncertainty. I'm advising you, Miguel replied. You're about to accuse a family of fraud based on nothing but your assumptions about how we look. You're about to humiliate my wife and children in front of dozens of witnesses. And you're about to make a decision that will follow you for the rest of your career. Victoria felt a flutter of panic in her chest. This wasn't going the way these confrontations usually went. Usually people backed down, apologized, accepted whatever treatment she decided to give them. This man wasn't backing down. Behind them, the line of passengers was growing restless. Several people had their phones out now, sensing that something significant was happening. Sarah Davidson watched from her station with growing unease, recognizing the signs of a situation spiraling out of control. Sir Victoria said, trying to reassert her authority. I don't appreciate your tone. I'm simply following airline policy. What policy? Miguel asked. The policy that says you get to harass passengers based on their appearance. The policy that allows you to accuse people of fraud without evidence. I'd like you to cite that specific policy for me. Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound. She had no policy to cite because what she was doing wasn't actually policy. It was prejudice dressed up as procedure. I need to verify, she began again. You need to do your job. Miguel interrupted, his voice still quiet, but now carrying the kind of authority that made people listen. Your job is to scan our boarding passes and allow us to board our flight. Your job is not to interrogate paying customers based on your personal assumptions. Carmen watched her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. She had seen this side of him only rarely, the leader, the commander, the man who had earned the respect of soldiers and officers. But she also knew that this kind of confrontation triggered memories he tried hard to suppress. Miguel, she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. He looked at her and saw not just his wife, but his anchor, the person who had helped him find his way back from the darkness of war and trauma. Her touch reminded him to stay calm, to choose his battles to protect his family without destroying himself in the process. Ma'am, he said, turning back to Victoria with forced calm. We have a flight to catch. Our boarding passes are valid. Our identification is valid. Our payment was authorized months ago. Please scan our passes and let us board. Victoria stared at him, feeling trapped between her prejudice and her growing realization that this situation was sliding beyond her control. Around them, passengers were openly recording now, their phones pointed at the confrontation with the hungry attention of people who sensed they were witnessing something that would soon be trending on social media. She could back down now. She could scan the passes, apologize for the delay, and let the family board with their dignity intact. But Victoria Ashford had never backed down from anyone she perceived as beneath her station. And looking at Miguel Rodriguez, seeing his casual clothes and quiet demeanor, she still couldn't believe he posed any real threat to her authority. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she could be. "I'm going to need you to step aside," she said, her voice carrying renewed confidence. "I need to verify these tickets with our fraud prevention department." The words hit the family like a physical blow. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Diego's finger hovered over his phone's record button. Carmen's hand tightened on Miguel's arm. And Miguel Rodriguez, Master Chief Navy Cross recipient, owner of a multi-million-dollar company, felt something inside him shift into a gear he hadn't used in years. The real confrontation was just beginning. The moment Victoria Ashford said Fraud Prevention Department, the atmosphere at Gate C14 transformed from routine boarding process to public spectacle. It was as if she had dropped a stone into still water, and the ripples of her accusation spread outward in waves of shock, indignation, and growing attention. Miguel felt his wife's hand tighten on his arm, felt his daughter press closer to his side, felt his son's eyes burning with the kind of righteous fury that only teenagers could muster. Around them, the carefully ordered world of airport boarding had dissolved into something raw and unpredictable. "Fraud prevention," Carmen repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "Are you serious, ma'am?" "Please keep your voice down," Victoria said. But her tone carried more desperation than authority now. She had expected submission, not resistance, and the family's refusal to be cowed was throwing her off her carefully rehearsed script. "Don't tell my wife to keep her voice down," Miguel said, and now his military bearing was impossible to miss. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened, and when he spoke, every word carried the weight of command. "You just accused us of fraud in front of dozens of people. You've humiliated my family based on nothing but your assumptions about how we look." Behind them, the line of first-class passengers had grown into a small crowd. Word was spreading through the gate area that something dramatic was happening at the boarding counter. People were abandoning their seats, moving closer to get a better view, holding up their phones like digital torches. Sarah Davidson watched from her station 20 feet away, her stomach knotting with anxiety. She had seen Victoria in these moods before, had watched her colleagues' prejudices play out in smaller, more subtle ways. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Maybe I should call Mr. Davenport," she whispered to James Crawford, a maintenance supervisor who was watching the confrontation with growing unease. "Maybe you should," James replied, already pulling out his phone. Near the front of the crowd, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Martinez was live-streaming the entire confrontation on Facebook. She had started the stream to show her grandchildren what airports looked like, but now she found herself broadcasting what appeared to be a textbook case of racial profiling to her 3,000 followers. "This is absolutely disgraceful," she muttered into her phone, adjusting the angle to get a better shot of Victoria's face. "This beautiful family is being harassed by this airline employee for no reason except the color of their skin." The comments on her live stream were already multiplying rapidly. "This is why I don't fly anymore. Get their names. This needs to go viral. Someone call the news stations." That poor little girl looks terrified. At the boarding counter, Victoria was beginning to realize that she had miscalculated badly. The situation she had expected to control with a few pointed questions and official-sounding procedures was spiraling into something much larger and more public than she had intended. "Sir, if you would just step aside for a moment," she began, but Miguel cut her off with a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakably commanding. "No," he said simply. "We're not stepping aside. We're not hiding while you figure out how to justify your prejudice. If you want to accuse us of fraud, do it here in front of everyone so they can see exactly what kind of operation Atlantic Airways runs." Victoria felt heat rising in her cheeks. The crowd was growing larger. The phones were multiplying, and she could see several passengers taking notes on their phones, probably typing up complaints that would land on her supervisor's desk before the flight even took off. But backing down now felt impossible. She had built her entire professional identity around being the person who didn't back down, who maintained standards, who kept people in their proper places. Admitting she was wrong would mean admitting that everything she believed about herself was wrong. "Fine," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of desperation disguised as authority. "I'm calling security." The word security rippled through the crowd like electricity. Diego's thumb finally pressed the record button on his phone, and suddenly the confrontation was being captured from multiple angles by multiple devices. "You're calling security because a family is trying to board a plane with valid tickets." Miguel asked, his voice still controlled but now carrying a tone that made several passengers take a step back. "I'm calling security because you're being disruptive and refusing to cooperate with standard verification procedures," Victoria replied, but even she could hear how weak her justification sounded. Elena Vasquez, a flight attendant for Atlantic Airways who was deadheading on the flight, had been watching the confrontation from her seat in the boarding area. She knew Victoria by reputation. The woman had a history of what she diplomatically called passenger relations challenges, but this was beyond anything Elena had witnessed before. She pulled out her work phone and began typing rapidly, "Emergency situation at gate C14. Passenger discrimination incident in progress. Media attention growing. Need management response immediately." She sent the message to Captain James Mitchell, knowing that as the pilot in command, he would want to be aware of any situation that might affect his flight. What Elena didn't know was that Captain Mitchell was currently in the crew lounge reviewing flight plans and weather reports. What she also didn't know was that Captain Mitchell owed his life to the man currently being humiliated at gate C14. Back at the counter, Victoria had picked up her desk phone and was dialing the airport security number. But as she waited for someone to answer, she made the mistake of looking directly at Miguel Rodriguez. For the first time, she really saw him. Not the assumptions she had made about his clothes or his family, but the man himself. She saw the controlled strength in his posture, the careful patience in his expression, the way he positioned himself protectively in front of his family. She saw someone who was choosing restraint when he could easily choose confrontation. It was the look of someone who had been tested by far greater challenges than an airport gate agent. For a moment, doubt flickered across her features. But then the security office answered her call, and the point of no return arrived with bureaucratic efficiency. Security. "This is Victoria Ashford, Senior Customer Relations Director at Gate C14. I need assistance with disruptive passengers who are refusing to cooperate with fraud verification procedures." The lie came easily wrapped in official language that transformed her prejudice into policy and her victims into perpetrators. Miguel heard every word, and something shifted in his expression. The last traces of diplomatic patience disappeared, replaced by the kind of cold assessment he had once used to evaluate enemy positions. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a new quality that made Victoria grip the phone tighter. "You just lied to airport security. You just filed a false report claiming we're being disruptive when we're simply standing here with valid boarding passes. You've escalated a situation that didn't need to exist, and now you've involved federal security in your personal prejudices." "I haven't done anything wrong," Victoria said, but her voice betrayed her growing uncertainty. "You've done everything wrong," Miguel replied. "And in about 5 minutes, when security arrives and asks you to explain exactly what fraud you've uncovered, exactly what disruption we've caused, exactly what policy we've violated, you're going to discover that your assumptions aren't evidence and your prejudices aren't procedures." Carmen watched her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. She could see the military training asserting itself, could see him shifting into command mode. But she also knew that this kind of confrontation brought back memories he tried hard to suppress. Papa Sophia whispered, tugging on Miguel's shirt. "Are we in trouble?" Miguel looked down at his daughter and felt his heart break a little. At 11 years old, she was learning the lesson that too many children learned too early, that the world would judge her not by her character, but by her appearance. "No, mija," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "We're not in trouble. Sometimes adults make mistakes, and when they do, other adults have to help them understand why those mistakes hurt people." Diego continued recording, his teenage sense of justice fully activated. He had grown up with social media, understood the power of viral videos, knew that sometimes the only way to fight institutional prejudice was to drag it into the light and let the world see it for what it was. "This is insane," he muttered into his phone camera. "We're literally just trying to get on a plane with tickets my mom saved for months to buy, and this lady is treating us like criminals." Around them, the crowd continued to grow. Other passengers were sharing the story on social media in real time, using hashtags like #airline discrimination and #justice for Rodriguez family. The Atlantic Airways brand was taking a beating in the court of public opinion, and the damage was spreading with every shared video and angry comment. Eleanor Martinez's Facebook live stream had been shared over 500 times in the past 10 minutes. Local news stations were starting to pick up the story. Twitter was beginning to trend with #GateC14, but Victoria Ashford was too deep in her own prejudices to see the storm building around her. All she could see was a family that didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in first class, and her determination to prove herself right was overriding every warning sign that she was destroying her career in real time. "Security is on the way," she announced, as if this vindicated her position instead of highlighting her complete mismanagement of the situation. Good Miguel said calmly, "When they arrive, I'll be very interested to hear you explain exactly what crime you think we've committed." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, her desk phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Atlantic Airways Operations Center. She answered with false confidence. "Gate C14, this is Victoria." "Victoria, this is Marcus Davenport. I'm getting reports of a passenger incident at your gate. What's your status?" Victoria felt her stomach drop. Word was already reaching management, which meant the situation was bigger than she had realized. "Everything is under control," she lied. "Just a routine verification issue." Victoria Davenport's voice carried a warning tone. "I'm looking at social media right now. There are videos of your gate all over the internet. This doesn't look routine to me." Around the counter, passengers with phones were indeed uploading content faster than Victoria could track. The story was spreading beyond the airport, beyond Miami, beyond Florida. Soon it would be a national news story. And Miguel Rodriguez, the quiet, unassuming man she had dismissed as unworthy of first class, was about to become the center of a conversation about dignity, respect, and justice that would reach millions of people. But the biggest surprise was still coming. Because in the crew lounge 3 terminals away, Captain James Mitchell had just received Elena Vasquez's text message and was now hurrying toward Gate C14 to see what the emergency was about. He had no idea that the passenger being discriminated against was the man who had saved his life in a firefight 15 years earlier. The collision of past and present was only minutes away. Airport security arrived at Gate C14 in the form of 2 officers whose presence immediately elevated the tension from uncomfortable to explosive. Officer David Brooks, a 20-year veteran with graying temples and weary eyes, approached the scene with the practiced calm of someone who had seen every possible airport drama. His partner, Officer Maria Santos, was younger and more alert, her hand resting casually near her radio as she assessed the situation. The crowd of passengers parted as the officers approached, but nobody left. If anything, more people pressed closer phones, held high social media notifications, pinging constantly as the story continued to spread across the digital landscape. "I'm Officer Brooks," the senior officer announced, his voice carrying the kind of measured authority that came from years of de-escalating airport conflicts. "We received a report of disruptive passengers and possible fraud. Can someone explain what's happening here?" Victoria stepped forward immediately, her designer heels clicking against the floor with renewed confidence. The presence of security felt like validation proof that she had been right to escalate the situation. Officers, I'm Victoria Ashford, Senior, Customer Relations Director for Atlantic Airways. These passengers are attempting to board first class with what appear to be suspicious tickets. When I tried to verify their legitimacy, they became aggressive and disruptive. Miguel felt his jaw clench at the word aggressive. Around him, he could hear murmurs of disbelief from the crowd, many of whom had witnessed the entire confrontation and knew exactly who had been aggressive and who had remained calm. Sir Officer Brooks said, turning to Miguel with professional neutrality, "Can you tell me your side of what happened here?" Miguel looked at the officer, then at Victoria, then at the crowd of strangers who had been transformed into witnesses and judges by the power of social media. This was the moment. He could de-escalate, apologize for any misunderstanding, take his family, and quietly board their flight. It would be the path of least resistance, the choice that avoided confrontation and got them to their destination without further drama. But looking at his daughter's tear-stained face, at his son's furious expression, at his wife's mixture of humiliation and defiance, Miguel realized that this wasn't just about their vacation anymore. This was about dignity. This was about justice. This was about the right of every family to travel without being subjected to prejudice disguised as policy. Officer Miguel said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made everyone in the vicinity pay attention. "My family and I have valid boarding passes for first-class seats that we purchased 3 months ago. We presented those passes along with valid identification. At no point have we been disruptive, aggressive, or uncooperative. What we have been is subjected to accusations of fraud based solely on this employee's assumptions about our appearance." Officer Santos was taking notes on her tablet, but Officer Brooks was studying Miguel's face with the recognition of someone who understood military bearing when he saw it. "Can I see your identification and boarding passes?" Brooks asked. Miguel handed over the documents without hesitation. Brooks examined them carefully, comparing photos to faces, checking the validity of the boarding passes against his own departmental procedures for identifying fraudulent travel documents. "Everything appears to be in order," Brooks said, finally looking up at Victoria. "Ma'am, can you tell me specifically what made you suspicious about these tickets?" Victoria felt the first flutter of real panic in her chest. The question was straightforward and professional, but she realized she had no legitimate answer. She couldn't say that she was suspicious because the family looked like they couldn't afford first class. She couldn't admit that her assumptions were based on racial profiling. She couldn't explain that her real concern was maintaining the exclusivity of premium seating for people who looked like her. Well, she began stalling for time. There have been issues with credit card fraud lately, and these particular seats are very expensive, and I thought it was prudent to verify. "Ma'am," Officer Brooks interrupted gently. "That's not what I asked. I asked what specifically made you suspicious about these particular tickets. Did they fail to scan properly? Were the names different from the identification? Did you notice signs of tampering or forgery?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound. Every answer she could give would expose her prejudice, but remaining silent was an admission of guilt in itself. I thought it was important to be thorough," she said weakly. "Ma'am," Officer Santos said, looking up from her tablet. "Are you telling us that you called security because you thought it was important to be thorough?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, the crowd's murmurs grew louder and more pointed. Someone in the back shouted, "This is racial profiling." Another voice added, "She's lying." Miguel watched Victoria's face as the reality of her situation became clear. She was trapped between her prejudices and her professional obligations, between what she believed and what she could legally admit to believing. "Officers," Miguel said quietly, I'd like to share some additional context that might help you understand this situation. He reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a leather folder that he opened carefully. Inside was an identification card that made Officer Brooks straighten slightly and Officer Santos look up sharply from her notes. Master Chief Miguel Rodriguez, United States Navy, retired, Miguel said, showing them his military ID along with his Department of Defense contractor credentials. I hold an active security clearance and work as a defense contractor providing anti-terrorism training for major airlines, including Atlantic Airways. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical wave. Phones that had been recording now pushed closer to capture every detail. Eleanor Martinez's Facebook live stream exploded with comments as viewers realized they were watching a military veteran being discriminated against by the very airline he helped protect. Victoria's face went white. She stared at the credentials in Miguel's hand as if they were written in a foreign language, trying to process the complete reversal of her assumptions. Sir Officer Brooks said, his tone shifting to one of respect. "Are you telling us that you actually work with Atlantic Airways in a professional capacity?" "I am," Miguel replied. "My company, AeroShield Defense Contractors, has held federal contracts with Atlantic Airways for 3 years. We provide security training, threat assessment, and counterterrorism protocols for their flight crews and ground personnel." The crowd erupted in gasps and angry comments. Diego's camera captured Victoria's expression of dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Carmen reached for Miguel's hand, squeezing it with pride and support. "Ma'am," Officer Santos said, turning to Victoria with barely concealed incredulity. "Are you telling us that you called security to report suspected fraud by a man who actually works for your airline's security department?" Victoria looked around desperately, searching for support that wasn't coming. Sarah Davidson had retreated to her station, unwilling to be associated with the disaster unfolding at the main counter. Other Atlantic Airways employees in the area were suddenly very busy with paperwork and passenger assistance. "I didn't know," Victoria whispered, but her voice was lost in the growing commotion around her. "Ma'am," Officer Brooks said firmly, "not knowing doesn't excuse racial profiling. Not knowing doesn't justify filing false reports or harassing passengers." Miguel stepped forward slightly, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "Officers," he said, "I don't want anyone arrested. I don't want charges filed. What I want is for my family to board our flight with dignity intact, and for Atlantic Airways to understand that this kind of treatment is unacceptable for any passenger, regardless of their background or credentials." Officer Santos was typing rapidly on her tablet, documenting everything for the report that would be filed with airport management, the Department of Transportation, and multiple federal agencies that oversaw airline operations. "Sir, we're going to need to file an incident report about this," Brooks said. "This kind of passenger profiling is taken very seriously by federal aviation authorities." Victoria felt her world collapsing around her. Federal reports meant federal investigations. Federal investigations meant corporate scrutiny. Corporate scrutiny meant the end of her career. But the worst was yet to come. Because at that moment, Elena Vasquez's text message reached Captain James Mitchell, and he was now walking rapidly through the terminal toward Gate C-14, completely unaware that his response to a routine passenger incident was about to become a reunion with the man who had saved his life in Afghanistan. The breaking point had arrived, but the real revelation was still coming. Victoria Ashford's perfectly constructed world was crumbling with architectural precision, each revelation stripping away another layer of her authority, until she stood exposed in front of dozens of witnesses and millions of potential viewers. The Department of Defense credentials in Miguel Rodriguez's hands weren't just identification. They were the detonator for her career's complete destruction. "I need to call my supervisor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, reaching for her desk phone with trembling fingers. "Ma'am," Officer Brooks said firmly, "you'll have plenty of time to call your supervisor after we complete our incident report. Right now, I need you to explain why you filed a false security report." The word false cut through the air like a legal verdict. Around them, the crowd had grown to over 100 passengers, airport employees, and curious onlookers who had been drawn by the commotion. Diego's live stream had been joined by at least 6 other people broadcasting the confrontation live, and hashtag #GateC14 was now trending nationally on Twitter. Victoria looked desperately around the area, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Her gaze landed on Sarah Davidson, who was standing at her station 20 feet away, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Sarah Victoria called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Sarah, tell them about our fraud prevention protocols." Sarah Davidson felt every eye in the terminal turn toward her. She was a first-generation college graduate who had worked 3 jobs to pay for her education, who sent money home to her parents in El Salvador every month, who understood exactly what it felt like to be judged by your appearance rather than your character. She walked slowly toward the main counter, her steps heavy with the weight of a decision that would define not just this moment, but her entire future with the airline. "Victoria," she said quietly, "we don't have fraud prevention protocols that allow us to profile passengers based on their appearance. You know that." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Her own subordinate had just contradicted her in front of security officers, passengers, and cameras that were broadcasting to audiences around the world. "Sarah, you don't understand the situation," Victoria began, but Sarah cut her off with a shake of her head. "I understand perfectly," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've watched you question passengers who don't look like they belong in first class. I've seen you demand additional verification from families like this one. I've stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my job, but I can't stay quiet anymore." The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of support. Eleanor Martinez's Facebook live stream comments were moving too fast to read as thousands of viewers shared their own stories of discrimination and praised Sarah for speaking up. Miguel watched Sarah Davidson with something approaching admiration. He understood the courage it took for someone in her position to stand up to authority, especially in such a public forum. Officer Miguel said, turning back to Brooks, "I want to make sure Ms. Davidson's statement is included in your report. She's showing exactly the kind of integrity that Atlantic Airways should be looking for in its employees." Victoria felt the final pieces of her defense crumble. Her own subordinate had turned against her. The passengers had turned against her. Security had turned against her. Even the abstract authority of airline policy had turned against her. But the humiliation was far from over. At that moment, Captain James Mitchell emerged from the jetway connecting to their aircraft, his Atlantic Airways uniform crisp and authoritative, his expression focused and concerned. Elena Vasquez had texted him about a passenger incident, but nothing had prepared him for the scene he encountered. He saw the crowd, the cameras, the security officers, and the obvious tension radiating from gate C14. His first instinct was to identify the problem and contain it before it could affect his flight schedule. "What's the situation here?" he called out, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that made people step aside to clear a path for him. Officer Brooks turned toward the captain. "Sir, we're investigating a passenger profiling incident involving your gate agent and a family with valid first-class tickets." Captain Mitchell nodded and began walking toward the counter to assess the situation. His gaze swept over the crowd, taking in the phones, the obvious anger of the passengers, and the defensive posture of the woman behind the counter. Then his eyes landed on Miguel Rodriguez, and Captain James Mitchell stopped walking as if he had hit an invisible wall. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the two men stared at each other across 15 years and thousands of miles. Miguel's face registered the same shock of recognition, the same flood of memories that had just overwhelmed the captain. Master Chief Captain Mitchell said, his voice filled with disbelief and something that sounded very much like reverence. The entire gate area fell silent. Passengers stopped talking. Phones continued recording, but the operators behind them held their breath. Even the security officers paused in their questioning to watch this unexpected reunion. Miguel straightened automatically, his military bearing asserting itself as he faced an officer he had once served with in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Captain Mitchell Miguel said simply, but his voice carried 15 years of unspoken history. Captain Mitchell began walking forward again, but now his steps had purpose beyond crowd control. As he approached Miguel, his right hand rose in a gesture that every person in the terminal recognized, and the entire gate area held its breath as Captain James Mitchell snapped to attention and delivered a crisp military salute to the man who had saved his life in Afghanistan. The cameras captured every second of it. The salute, the recognition, the obvious respect flowing from the captain to the passenger who had just been accused of fraud. Diego's live stream exploded with viewers as the story took on dimensions that no one could have predicted. Victoria Ashford watched this moment of recognition and honor and finally understood that she hadn't just made a mistake. She had committed career suicide in front of millions of witnesses. The point of no return wasn't just behind her, it was being broadcast live to the world. The military salute that Captain James Mitchell delivered to Miguel Rodriguez at Gate C-14 was captured by 17 different cameras shared on 8 social media platforms and witnessed by over 200 people in person. It was a moment that transformed a routine discrimination incident into something far more powerful and far-reaching. The salute held for exactly 7 seconds proper military protocol before Captain Mitchell lowered his hand and stepped forward with obvious emotion. "Master Chief Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect usually reserved for national monuments. "It's an honor to see you again, sir." The crowd around them buzzed with confusion and excitement. They had witnessed something significant, but most of them didn't understand exactly what they had seen. The live streamers and video recorders sensed that the story had just taken a dramatic turn, but they needed context to understand its full significance. Miguel returned the captain's salute with the automatic precision of someone whose military training was embedded in his muscle memory, then extended his hand for a handshake that became something closer to an embrace. "It's good to see you," Captain Miguel said simply, but his voice carried 15 years of relief and healing. "You look well." Officer Brooks and Officer Santos exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple passenger complaint. The racial profiling incident was still their primary concern, but the obvious connection between the victim and the airline's captain added layers of complication they hadn't anticipated. "Gentlemen," Officer Brooks interrupted diplomatically, "I don't mean to interrupt your reunion, but we still have an active investigation here." Captain Mitchell turned toward the officers, then looked at Victoria Ashford behind the counter, then back at Miguel. The pieces of the situation began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Officer Captain Mitchell said, his voice shifting into a more formal register. "Are you telling me that Master Chief Rodriguez and his family have been subjected to discriminatory treatment by Atlantic Airways personnel?" "That appears to be the case, sir," Officer Santos replied, consulting her notes. Ashford called security, claiming the family was disruptive and potentially using fraudulent tickets, but our investigation has found no evidence to support those allegations. Captain Mitchell's expression darkened as he turned to look at Victoria. She had retreated behind her counter as if the polished wood surface could somehow protect her from the consequences of her actions. "Ms. Ashford," Captain Mitchell said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned flight crews nervous, "would you care to explain to me why you thought it was appropriate to harass the man who saved my life?" The statement hit the crowd like lightning. Suddenly, the salute made sense. Suddenly, the respect and emotion in the captain's voice had context. The passengers who had been filming and sharing the story realized they had stumbled onto something extraordinary. Eleanor Martinez, whose Facebook live stream was now being viewed by over 50,000 people in real time, spoke directly into her phone camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing something incredible here. This airline employee just discriminated against a military hero, and now his captain is here to defend him." Diego's YouTube stream was experiencing technical difficulties from the sheer volume of viewers trying to watch simultaneously. His subscriber count was climbing by thousands every minute as news of the confrontation spread across social media networks. Victoria found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper I didn't know. I had no idea who he was. That's exactly the problem, Captain Mitchell replied, stepping closer to her counter. You saw a man, a woman, and 2 children with valid tickets, and your first instinct was to assume they were criminals. You didn't need to know who Master Chief Rodriguez was to treat him with basic human dignity. Carmen Rodriguez watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had known her husband was respected by his former colleagues, but seeing that respect demonstrated so publicly was overwhelming. Sophia and Diego flanked their parents, both of them wide-eyed at seeing their father honored by a man in uniform. For Sophia, this was the first time she had truly understood that her quiet, modest father was someone special. For Diego, this was becoming the most important video he would ever capture. Captain Mitchell Miguel said quietly, "Could you help these officers understand our connection? I think it might provide some context for what happened here." Captain Mitchell nodded and turned to address Officers Brooks and Santos, but his voice was loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. 15 years ago in Afghanistan, I was a young lieutenant leading a reconnaissance patrol in hostile territory. Our unit was ambushed in a mountain pass. I took shrapnel in both legs and couldn't walk. Enemy forces had us pinned down and we were running low on ammunition. The gate area had fallen completely silent except for the soft sounds of phones recording and the distant announcements from other terminals. This was the kind of story that transformed routine airport drama into something approaching legend. Master Chief Rodriguez was part of a Navy SEAL unit conducting operations in the same region. When they got word that Army personnel were trapped, he led a rescue mission into the firefight. Under heavy enemy fire, he personally carried me 2 miles through mountain terrain to reach the evacuation point. He saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers that day. Captain Mitchell's voice grew stronger as he continued. Master Chief Rodriguez was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that day, the second highest decoration for valor that our country can bestow. He's a genuine American hero, and the fact that any employee of this airline would treat him and his family with suspicion and disrespect is absolutely unacceptable. The crowd erupted in applause and angry shouts directed at Victoria. The story was spreading beyond the airport, now being picked up by news outlets, shared by military veterans organizations, and discussed in online forums dedicated to social justice. Officer Santos finished typing her notes and looked up at Captain Mitchell. "Sir, this information will definitely be included in our report. However, I want to be clear that even if Mr. Rodriguez had no military background whatsoever, the treatment he received would still be unacceptable and potentially illegal." Absolutely, Captain Mitchell agreed. Every passenger deserves respect regardless of their service record or their appearance. But the fact that Ms. Ashford chose to harass a decorated veteran makes this situation even more egregious. Victoria tried one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. "Captain Mitchell, I was just following standard verification procedures." No, Captain Mitchell cut her off with military precision. "You were following your prejudices. There are no standard procedures that allow gate agents to profile passengers based on their race or their clothing. There are no policies that permit you to file false security reports. What you did was discriminate against a paying passenger, and then you lied about it to airport security." Miguel watched this exchange with mixed feelings. He was grateful for the captain's support, but he also understood that this public confrontation was spiraling far beyond what he had originally intended. What had started as a simple attempt to board a flight with dignity was now becoming a national conversation about discrimination, military service, and corporate responsibility. Captain Miguel said, "I appreciate your support more than I can express, but right now my primary concern is getting my family on that plane so we can continue with our vacation." Captain Mitchell nodded, understanding the subtext. Miguel wasn't looking for revenge or public attention. He was looking for resolution and closure. "Of course, Master Chief. Your family has been through enough already." Captain Mitchell turned to Victoria with an expression that could have frozen jet fuel. "Ms. Ashford, you will personally escort the Rodriguez family to their first-class seats. You will ensure they receive the highest level of service throughout the flight, and you will do it with the respect and courtesy that should have been offered from the beginning." Actually, a new voice interrupted from the edge of the crowd. "I don't think Ms. Ashford will be escorting anyone anywhere." All heads turned to see a man in an expensive suit pushing through the crowd. His face grim with the expression of someone who had been watching social media feeds and airline stock prices plummet in real time. Marcus Davenport, Regional Director for Atlantic Airways, had arrived to take control of a situation that was already far beyond anyone's control. The consequences were about to become very real and very immediate. Marcus Davenport approached Gate C-14 like a man walking toward his own execution. As Regional Director for Atlantic Airways, he had been monitoring the situation through social media feeds, employee reports, and increasingly frantic phone calls from corporate headquarters. The video of Captain Mitchell's salute had already been viewed over 2 million times, and the airline's stock price had dropped 3% in the past 20 minutes. "Captain Mitchell." Master Chief Rodriguez Davenport said, his voice carrying the controlled desperation of a man trying to contain a public relations nuclear explosion. "I'm Marcus Davenport, Regional Director for Atlantic Airways. I sincerely apologize for this situation, and I'm here to make it right." Miguel assessed Davenport with the same careful attention he had once used to evaluate potentially hostile contacts in Afghanistan. He saw a corporate executive in crisis mode, someone more concerned with damage control than with genuine justice. Mr. Davenport Miguel said evenly making it right would have been ensuring this situation never happened in the first place. Davenport nodded, accepting the criticism because he had no choice. Behind him, more Atlantic Airways personnel were arriving. Supervisors, customer service managers, and corporate representatives who had been summoned to deal with what was rapidly becoming the airline's worst public relations disaster of the year. "You're absolutely right," Davenport said. "And I want to assure you that we're going to take immediate action to address this incident and prevent anything like it from happening again." Victoria Ashford watched from behind her counter as her professional world collapsed around her. She could see the writing on the wall in Davenport's grim expression, in the way the other Atlantic Airways employees were deliberately avoiding eye contact with her in the smartphones that continued to document every moment of her humiliation. "Ma'am," Officer Brooks said, turning to Victoria, "we need to complete our incident report. I'll need you to provide a statement about your actions and the procedures you followed." Victoria looked at Davenport, silently pleading for support that she knew wouldn't come. No airline executive was going to defend racial profiling captured on video and shared millions of times. "Officers," Davenport interrupted, "before you complete your report, there's additional information about Mr. Rodriguez that everyone should know." Miguel looked at Davenport sharply, wondering what else the airline executive thought he knew about their relationship. Mr. Rodriguez Davenport continued, "Isn't just a valued passenger. His company, AeroShield Defense Contractors, has been one of our primary security training partners for 3 years. The irony of this situation is that Ms. Ashford discriminated against the man whose company has been training our employees to prevent exactly this kind of incident." The revelation sent another wave of gasps and angry comments through the crowd. Diego's live stream chat exploded with viewers expressing disbelief that an airline employee would profile the very person who had been training them about bias prevention. Furthermore, Davenport said, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a tablet, "AeroShield's current contract with Atlantic Airways is worth $75 million over 5 years. Mr. Rodriguez isn't just a passenger. He's one of our most important business partners." Miguel felt uncomfortable with the emphasis on his financial relationship with the airline. While the business connection added another layer of irony to Victoria's actions, He didn't want his treatment to be contingent on his economic value to the company. Mr. Davenport Miguel said firmly, "I appreciate you providing that context, but I want to be clear about something. My family and I should have been treated with respect whether I had any business relationship with Atlantic Airways or not. Every passenger deserves dignity regardless of their economic status or professional connections." Captain Mitchell nodded approvingly at Miguel's statement. "Master Chief Rodriguez is exactly right. The problem isn't that Ms. Ashford discriminated against someone important to the airline. The problem is that she discriminated against anyone at all." Officer Santos looked up from her tablet where she had been documenting the increasingly complex web of relationships and revelations. "Mr. Davenport, we're going to need a complete statement from you about your company's policies regarding passenger treatment and discrimination. This incident is going to require a comprehensive federal investigation." Davenport's face paled at the mention of federal investigation. Atlantic Airways was already under scrutiny from the Department of Transportation for previous discrimination complaints, and this very public incident was likely to trigger a comprehensive review of their practices. "Of course," Davenport said, "we'll cooperate fully with any investigation, but right now our priority is making sure the Rodriguez family receives the treatment they should have received from the beginning." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. "Mr. Davenport, I was following the procedures I was trained to use. If someone looks like they might not belong in first class, we're supposed to verify." Ms. Ashford Davenport cut her off sharply. "Stop talking. Every word you say is making this situation worse and creating more legal liability for this company." But Victoria was beyond rational thought. The reality of losing her career, her reputation, and her identity was driving her to increasingly desperate attempts at self-justification. "I was protecting the airline," she said, her voice rising. "First class is supposed to be exclusive. These people don't look like they belong there." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Even Victoria seemed to realize she had just confessed to exactly the kind of racial profiling that Atlantic Airways would spend years trying to distance themselves from. Officer Brooks closed his tablet with a decisive snap. "Ma'am, I think we have everything we need for our report. You've just admitted to profiling passengers based on their appearance, which violates both federal anti-discrimination laws and your company's stated policies." Diego's phone was capturing every second of Victoria's meltdown, and his live stream viewers were creating clips and memes faster than he could read the comments. The phrase, "These people don't look like they belong there," was already being quoted and shared across social media platforms. Carmen Rodriguez watched the destruction of Victoria's career with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She understood the anger that drove discrimination, but she also understood that hate ultimately destroyed the person who harbored it more than its intended targets. "Miguel," she said softly, touching her husband's arm, "maybe we should just get on the plane now." Miguel looked at his wife and saw the exhaustion in her eyes. This confrontation had taken an emotional toll on all of them, but especially on Carmen, who had sacrificed so much to make this trip possible. "Mr. Davenport Miguel said my family has been through enough today. We'd like to board our flight now if that's possible." "Absolutely," Davenport replied quickly. "Captain Mitchell, would you personally escort the Rodriguez family to their seats?" Captain Mitchell straightened to attention. "It would be my honor." As the family prepared to finally board their flight, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her career. "Wait," she called out. "This isn't fair. I've worked for this airline for 8 years. I've followed every policy. You've just destroyed your career on live television," Sarah Davidson said, stepping forward with a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. "And honestly, it's about time someone held you accountable for the way you treat passengers who don't look like you." The crowd erupted in applause for Sarah's statement. Here was an employee willing to speak truth to power, willing to stand up for what was right, even when it meant confronting her supervisor. Davenport made a note on his tablet. Ms. Davidson, I'd like to speak with you after we resolve this situation. Your willingness to tell the truth in a difficult situation is exactly the kind of integrity we need more of. As Captain Mitchell prepared to escort the Rodriguez family to their aircraft, Miguel paused and turned back to address the crowd that had witnessed this entire confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone stop and listen. I want you to know that this isn't really about me or my family. This is about dignity. This is about treating every person with respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Don't share this story because you feel sorry for us. Share it because you believe every family deserves to travel without being judged by their appearance. The crowd burst into sustained applause as Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Diego finally walked toward their aircraft, escorted by Captain Mitchell and followed by the cameras that would ensure their story reached every corner of the globe. Behind them, Victoria Ashford's career officially ended as Davenport informed her that her employment with Atlantic Airways was terminated effective immediately. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and the consequences were just beginning. The walk from gate C-14 to the aircraft door took less than 3 minutes, but in that time, Miguel Rodriguez went from being an anonymous passenger to becoming the center of a national conversation about dignity, respect, and justice. Captain Mitchell personally escorted the family through the jetway, his presence ensuring that every Atlantic Airways employee they encountered treated them with the reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Flight attendant Elena Vasquez was waiting at the aircraft door, her face showing a mixture of professional composure and personal embarrassment about her airline's treatment of the Rodriguez family. Master Chief Rodriguez. Mrs. Rodriguez, she said formally on behalf of the entire crew of Flight 447. I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received at the gate. We're honored to have you aboard, and we'll do everything possible to ensure your flight is comfortable and peaceful. Sophia looked up at her father with new understanding. She was beginning to realize that her quiet, modest papa was someone very special, someone that other people respected and honored in ways she had never seen before. Diego was still live streaming, though he had shifted to a more respectful tone now that they were actually boarding the aircraft. His viewer count had stabilized at around 80,000 people, many of whom were military veterans sharing their own stories of discrimination and expressing support for his family. As they settled into their first-class seats, 3A through 3D, just as they had originally planned. Captain Mitchell knelt beside Miguel's seat with the kind of respect usually shown to superior officers. "Master Chief," he said quietly, "I need you to know that what happened today isn't representative of Atlantic Airways or its values. Most of our employees understand and appreciate the sacrifices you and others like you have made for our country." Miguel nodded, appreciating the captain's sincerity while also understanding the corporate damage control aspects of his statement. Captain Miguel replied, "I know that most people in your company are good people trying to do their jobs with integrity. But this incident shows that you still have work to do in training your personnel about bias and discrimination." Behind them, in the coach section, word was spreading about the identity of the first-class passengers who had been discriminated against at the gate. Other passengers were approaching flight attendants to ask about the situation, creating a buzz of conversation that rippled through the entire aircraft. Elena Vasquez returned to Miguel's seat with a tablet in her hand. "Sir," she said diplomatically, "I've been asked to inform you that Atlantic Airways corporate headquarters would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. They've authorized me to offer you and your family complimentary upgrades to first class on any Atlantic Airways flight for the next 2 years, as well as a formal written apology from our CEO." Miguel looked at Carmen, who was holding Sophia's hand and trying to process everything that had happened. His wife's expression showed exhaustion mixed with a kind of proud satisfaction that justice had been served. Elena Miguel said, "Right now my family just wants to get to Washington, D.C., so we can visit the memorials and have the vacation my wife planned for us. We'll deal with corporate conversations after we return to Miami." "Of course, sir. I completely understand." As the aircraft pulled back from the gate, Miguel received a text message on his phone. It was from Admiral Robert Sullivan, his former commanding officer who was now serving at the Pentagon. Miguel just saw the video. "Proud of how you handled yourself. Dignity under fire as always. Call me when you get to D.C. We need to talk about some opportunities that might interest you." Miguel smiled slightly, recognizing that this incident was likely to open doors he hadn't even considered. But right now, his focus was on his family and their healing trip to the nation's capital. Meanwhile, back at Gate C-14, the aftermath of Victoria Ashford's termination was playing out in front of the cameras that had never stopped recording. Marcus Davenport was conducting an impromptu press conference with the passengers and media representatives who had gathered to document the story. Atlantic Airways does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Davenport announced, his voice carrying the hollow ring of corporate crisis management. Ms. Ashford's actions were contrary to our policies, our training, and our values. Her employment has been terminated, effective immediately. A reporter from a local Miami news station pushed through the crowd with a microphone. "Mr. Davenport, this is the third discrimination incident involving Atlantic Airways this year. What concrete steps is your airline taking to prevent this from happening again?" Davenport looked uncomfortable with the question, clearly unprepared for the level of media scrutiny the incident had attracted. "We're implementing comprehensive sensitivity training for all customer-facing personnel," he replied. "We're also reviewing our hiring practices and updating our policy manuals to ensure that every employee understands the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect." Sarah Davidson watched this exchange from her station, where she was now the senior gate agent by default. Her decision to speak up against Victoria's discrimination had already led to 3 job offers from competing airlines, all of whom wanted to hire someone with the integrity to do the right thing under pressure. Officer Brooks and Officer Santos had completed their incident report, which would be forwarded to multiple federal agencies including the Department of Transportation, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Victoria Ashford's actions had triggered investigations that would examine not just this incident but Atlantic Airways' entire pattern of passenger treatment. The ripple effects were spreading far beyond Miami International Airport. Military veterans organizations were sharing the video and using it as an example of the discrimination that service members often faced in civilian life. Civil rights groups were citing it as evidence of ongoing widespread racism in the airline industry. Business publications were analyzing the financial impact on Atlantic Airways' stock price and reputation. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the thousands of people who saw the video and recognized their own experiences with discrimination, bias, and prejudice. Miguel Rodriguez's calm dignity in the face of injustice was inspiring others to speak up, stand up, and demand the respect that every human being deserved. As Flight 447 climbed to cruising altitude, Miguel held Carmen's hand and watched his children settle in for the flight. Sophia was reading a book about the Washington Monument, excited about their upcoming visit to the memorials. Diego was editing the video footage on his laptop, preparing to create a documentary about the day that would help his college applications and showcase his filmmaking skills. Outside the aircraft windows, the Florida coastline gave way to open water, and then to the landscape of a country that Miguel had served with honor and distinction. He thought about the men who hadn't made it home, about the sacrifices that had earned him the respect demonstrated by Captain Mitchell's salute, about the responsibility that came with being called a hero. This incident wasn't really about him, he realized. It was about the ongoing struggle for dignity and justice that defined American democracy. It was about the choice that every person faced when confronted with injustice: remain silent or speak up, accept discrimination or demand better. Miguel Rodriguez had chosen to speak up, and his voice had been heard around the world. 37,000 feet above the eastern seaboard, Flight 447 had transformed into something approaching a flying tribute to the Rodriguez family. Word had spread throughout the aircraft about Miguel's military service and the discrimination he had faced at the gate, creating an atmosphere of respect and solidarity that Elena Vasquez had never experienced in her 8 years as a flight attendant. Passengers from coach were approaching the first-class cabin to shake Miguel's hand, thank him for his service, and express their outrage about the treatment his family had received. A retired Marine colonel from seat 12B had personally delivered a handwritten note thanking Miguel for his actions in Afghanistan. A group of college students had pooled their money to buy drinks for the entire family. But the most meaningful moment came when Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 37,000 feet with clear skies ahead and an on-time arrival in Washington, D.C. But before we continue with routine announcements, I want to take a moment to recognize someone special on our flight today." Miguel looked up from his book, realizing what was about to happen, and feeling simultaneously honored and uncomfortable with the public attention. "We have the privilege of carrying Master Chief Miguel Rodriguez and his family to the nation's capital today. 15 years ago, Master Chief Rodriguez saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers in Afghanistan. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his heroism, and he represents the finest values of service, courage, and sacrifice that make our country great." The entire aircraft erupted in applause. Passengers turned in their seats to see Miguel, many of them standing to show their respect. Flight attendants joined the applause, and even the cockpit crew could be heard clapping over the intercom system. Sophia looked at her father with wonder and pride. She had always known her papa was special, but she was finally beginning to understand why. The quiet man who helped her with homework and fixed her bicycle was the same person who had risked his life to save others in a foreign country. Diego had stopped editing his video to watch his father's reaction to the recognition. Miguel's expression showed a mixture of gratitude and humility that Diego was beginning to understand was characteristic of real heroism. Heroes didn't seek attention, they sought to serve others, even when that service came at great personal cost. Carmen squeezed her husband's hand as the applause continued. She thought about the years of quiet struggle Miguel had endured as he transitioned from military to civilian life, the nightmares he still sometimes had, the way he sometimes stared out windows as if watching for threats that weren't there. This public recognition felt like a form of healing, a way for the world to acknowledge not just his heroism, but his humanity. When the applause finally died down, Captain Mitchell continued his announcement. "Master Chief Rodriguez and his family were subjected to unacceptable discrimination at our gate today. As your captain, I want you to know that such treatment is contrary to everything Atlantic Airways stands for and everything America stands for. We're honored to serve passengers of all backgrounds, and we're especially honored to serve those who have served our country." More applause followed, and Miguel finally stood to acknowledge the recognition. His simple gesture of raising his hand in thanks seemed to satisfy the passengers who settled back into their seats with obvious satisfaction that justice had been served. As the flight continued, Miguel found himself in conversation with several passengers who were also military veterans. A retired Air Force pilot shared stories about his experiences with discrimination during the early years of military integration. A young Army sergeant talked about the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life after deployments in Iraq. These conversations reminded Miguel why this incident was about more than just his family's vacation. Discrimination against military veterans was a broader problem that needed to be addressed, and his public platform could be used to shine light on issues that often remained hidden. Elena Vasquez approached their seats during the meal service with obvious nervousness. "Master Chief Rodriguez," she said quietly, "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened at the gate. I've worked for Atlantic Airways for 8 years, and I've seen incidents like this before. I've always stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my job. But after watching you stand up for your family today, I realized that staying quiet makes me part of the problem." Miguel looked at the young flight attendant and saw someone struggling with the same choices that faced everyone who witnessed injustice: speak up or stay safe, fight back or go along. "Elena," he said gently, "you have a choice to make about the kind of person you want to be and the kind of airline you want to work for. If you see discrimination happening, you have the power to speak up. You have the power to make things better." Elena nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I want to do better. I want to be better." "Then be better," Miguel said simply. "It's never too late to start." As the flight prepared for descent into Washington, D.C., Miguel looked around at his family and felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Sophia was asleep against Carmen's shoulder, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. Diego was reviewing his footage, already planning how to tell their story in a way that would inspire others to stand up for justice. Carmen was reading their itinerary for the next day's visit to the Navy Memorial, but Miguel could see that she was also processing everything that had happened. His wife was a strong woman who had supported him through his darkest moments, and seeing her pride in his actions today filled him with gratitude. The captain's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The weather is clear and we expect an on-time arrival. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying Atlantic Airways and Master Chief Rodriguez. Thank you for your service to our country." As the aircraft began its descent toward the nation's capital, Miguel thought about the memorials they would visit tomorrow, the sacrifices they commemorated, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality that defined American democracy. This incident at the airport wasn't just about his family. It was about the kind of country America aspired to be, and the work required to make those aspirations reality. The healing his family had come to find in Washington, D.C., had already begun 37,000 feet above the ground, in the recognition and respect shown by strangers who understood that heroism came in many forms, and that dignity was something every person deserved. The black granite wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial reflected the morning sun like a mirror of memory and sacrifice, as Miguel Rodriguez stood before it with his family 3 days after the incident at Miami International Airport had made them reluctant celebrities. Their visit to Washington, D.C. had been transformed from a private family healing journey into something approaching a state occasion. Admiral Robert Sullivan Miguel's former commanding officer, who now served as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations at the Pentagon, had personally arranged for a military escort to meet them at Reagan National Airport. The family that had been discriminated against for appearing unsuitable for first class was now traveling with the kind of security detail usually reserved for foreign dignitaries. Master Chief Admiral Sullivan said as they approached the Navy Memorial, "I want you to know that your actions this week have resonated throughout the entire military community. Sometimes it takes a civilian confrontation to remind us what we're really fighting for." Sophia and Diego flanked their father as he traced the name of a fallen comrade on the memorial wall. For the children, this visit was providing context for their father's quiet heroism and helping them understand why strangers had applauded him on the airplane. Carmen watched her husband with the patient understanding of someone who had lived with his memories for 15 years. She could see the way his shoulders relaxed in this place, surrounded by the names of people who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Here among these memorials, Miguel's service felt acknowledged and honored in ways that civilian recognition could never quite achieve. The media attention had been overwhelming, but carefully managed by the Navy's Public Affairs Office. Miguel had given only one interview to a military journalist who understood the importance of letting veterans tell their own stories. The focus remained on dignity, respect, and the ongoing struggle against discrimination, rather than on personal celebrity. Papa Sophia said quietly, "Why are there so many names on this wall?" Miguel knelt beside his daughter and pointed to a section of the black granite. "These are people who went to war and never came home, mija. They gave their lives so that other people could be free. Like you almost did." Miguel looked at his daughter's serious face and felt the weight of responsibility that came with surviving when others hadn't. Like I was prepared to do, yes. But I was lucky enough to come home to your mama and to you and Diego. Admiral Sullivan approached with a small wooden box in his hands. Master Chief, there's something I've been authorized to present to you. Miguel stood and accepted the box with the automatic precision of someone whose military training was embedded in his muscle memory. Inside was a medal he had never seen before, a special commendation created by the Secretary of the Navy specifically to honor his service in Afghanistan and his dignified response to discrimination. This is the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for Civilian Leadership, Admiral Sullivan explained. It's being awarded to recognize not just your military service, but your continued representation of Navy values in civilian life. Your response to injustice this week showed the same courage and dignity you demonstrated in Afghanistan. The presentation was captured by a single Navy photographer whose images would be distributed to military publications and veterans organizations around the world. But for Miguel, the most meaningful part of the ceremony was the way his children watched with growing understanding of their father's place in the larger story of American service and sacrifice. After the ceremony, the family visited the other memorials on the National Mall. At the Lincoln Memorial, Miguel read the Gettysburg Address aloud to his children, emphasizing Lincoln's words about ensuring that these dead shall not have died in vain. That's why your story matters, he told Diego and Sofia. Not because we were treated badly, but because standing up to injustice honors the people who died to protect our freedoms. Diego had been working on a documentary about their experience, combining his airport footage with interviews and historical context about military service and civil rights. His video editing skills, developed through years of YouTube content creation, were helping him craft a narrative that connected their personal story to larger themes of justice and equality. Dad Diego said as they walked toward the Washington Monument, "I've been getting messages from other kids who say my video inspired them to stand up to bullying at their schools. Is that what you wanted to happen?" Miguel considered the question carefully. "I didn't want any of this to happen, son. I wanted us to have a quiet vacation. But since it did happen, I'm glad people are using our story to make positive changes in their own lives." That evening at their hotel, Miguel finally returned the phone calls that had been piling up from news organizations, veteran groups, and civil rights organizations. But the call he was most interested in came from Sarah Davidson, the Atlantic Airways gate agent, who had spoken up against Victoria Ashford's discrimination. Master Chief Rodriguez Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination, "I wanted to thank you for inspiring me to tell the truth, because I stood up for what was right. I've been promoted to Regional Customer Service Manager. Atlantic Airways is putting me in charge of developing new anti-discrimination training for all their employees." Miguel smiled, understanding that Sarah's promotion was probably the most meaningful consequence of the entire incident. Real change happened when good people found the courage to speak up, and Sarah Davidson's willingness to confront injustice would have a lasting impact on thousands of future passengers. Sarah Miguel said, "You're the real hero of this story. You had the courage to do the right thing when it could have cost you your job. That's the kind of integrity that makes institutions better." As their Washington, D.C. trip drew to a close, the Rodriguez family had found the healing they had come looking for, though not in the way Carmen had originally planned. Miguel's memories of Afghanistan were still painful, but they were now balanced by the knowledge that his service continued to have meaning and impact. The discrimination they had faced at Gate C-14 had been transformed into a platform for positive change. Atlantic Airways had implemented comprehensive anti-bias training for all employees. Federal aviation authorities had announced new oversight procedures for airline discrimination complaints. Military veterans organizations had launched campaigns to educate the public about the ongoing challenges faced by service members. But perhaps most importantly, Miguel Rodriguez had found his voice as an advocate for dignity and justice. The quiet man who had carried his heroism in silence for 15 years was now using his platform to speak up for others who face discrimination and prejudice. Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as the sun set over the nation's capital, Miguel held his family close and felt a sense of peace that had been absent since his return from Afghanistan. His service had mattered. His sacrifice had meaning, and his continued fight for justice would honor the memory of those who hadn't made it home. The healing they had come to Washington to find was complete, but their mission to make the world more just was just beginning. 6 months after the incident at Gate C-14, Miguel Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, delivering the keynote address at the first annual Conference on Military Veterans and Civil Rights. The audience included generals, admirals, senators, civil rights leaders, and hundreds of service members who had experienced discrimination in civilian life. But the moment that meant the most to Miguel was seeing Sarah Davidson in the front row wearing her new Atlantic Airways regional manager uniform and taking notes on her tablet as she prepared to implement the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in airline industry history. 6 months ago, Miguel began his voice carrying the same calm authority that had diffused the confrontation at Miami International Airport. My family and I were subjected to discrimination simply because someone made assumptions about us based on our appearance. That incident could have ended with hurt feelings and a ruined vacation. Instead, it became a catalyst for change that has touched thousands of lives. The audience listened with the focused attention that military personnel brought to important briefings. But Miguel knew he wasn't just speaking to service members. This event was being live-streamed to military bases around the world, and recordings would be used in diversity training programs throughout the federal government. The real victory wasn't getting an apology from the airline. Miguel continued. The real victory was watching a young gate agent named Sarah Davidson find the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it could have cost her career. The real victory was seeing my children learn that dignity is something you maintain under pressure, not something you demand from others. In the audience, Carmen held Sophia's hand as their daughter listened to her father speak about courage and justice to some of the most powerful people in the country. Diego was live-streaming the speech to his YouTube channel, which now had over 400,000 subscribers interested in stories about social justice and military service. But the most important victory, Miguel said, has been the conversations this incident started in families, schools, workplaces, and communities across America. Discrimination thrives in silence and dies in the light of truth. When we speak up about injustice, we create space for others to do the same. The presentation included a video montage of the changes that had resulted from their story going viral. Atlantic Airways had implemented Sarah Davidson's training program across all their operations, resulting in a 78% reduction in discrimination complaints. The Department of Transportation had created new oversight procedures for airline bias incidents. Military veterans organizations had launched educational campaigns that had reached millions of people. But the most powerful part of the video featured testimonials from ordinary people who had been inspired by the Rodriguez family's story to stand up to discrimination in their own lives. A high school student in Texas who had confronted racist bullying, a Muslim woman in Michigan who had filed a complaint about workplace harassment, an elderly Hispanic man in California who had challenged discriminatory treatment at a government office. These are the real heroes, Miguel said as the video concluded. These are the people who prove that courage is contagious, and that one voice raised in defense of justice can inspire thousands of others. Admiral Sullivan approached the podium to present Miguel with a special recognition from the Secretary of Defense, but Miguel gestured for his family to join him on stage. This honor belongs to all of us, Miguel said, putting his arms around Carmen, Sophia, and Diego. Carmen, who taught me that healing comes from facing difficult truths together. Sophia, who reminded me that children learn more from watching what we do than from hearing what we say. And Diego, who showed me that the next generation understands the power of truth and the responsibility that comes with having a platform. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but Miguel was focused on his family's faces. Sofia was beaming with pride at her father's recognition. Diego was documenting everything for the scholarship application essays that would help him get into his first-choice journalism program. Carmen was crying with the kind of tears that came from watching someone you love find their purpose and their voice. After the ceremony, Miguel spent time in individual conversations with service members who had faced their own experiences with discrimination. A transgender Army sergeant talked about the challenges of transitioning while serving. A Latina Air Force pilot discussed the assumptions people made about her qualifications. A Black Navy petty officer shared his experiences with racial profiling during off-duty travel. These conversations reminded Miguel why their story had resonated so widely. Discrimination wasn't just an abstract policy issue. It was a personal experience that affected real people with real families and real dreams. Master Chief. A young Marine corporal said your example helped me report harassment I was experiencing from my supervisor. When I saw how you handled that situation with dignity and strength, it gave me the courage to speak up. Stories like this had been arriving regularly through social media, email, and military channels. The Rodriguez family's experience had become a case study in leadership development courses, diversity training programs, and civil rights education curricula. That evening, the family returned to their hotel room and finally had a quiet moment to process the day's events. Sofia was working on a school report about civil rights heroes, and she had decided to write about her father's actions at the airport. "Papa," she said, looking up from her notebook, "my teacher asked me what makes someone a hero. What should I tell her?" Miguel sat down beside his daughter and considered the question carefully. Heroes aren't people who aren't afraid, mija. Heroes are people who do the right thing even when they are afraid. Heroes are people who stand up for others, even when it's easier to stay quiet. Diego was editing the footage from the Pentagon ceremony, preparing to create a documentary that would serve as his senior project in high school. His video about the airport incident had been viewed over 15 million times and had been featured in news stories around the world. Dad Diego said, "Do you ever regret that our vacation got interrupted by all this attention?" Miguel looked at his son and smiled. "I regret that discrimination exists and that people have to face it. But I don't regret that we were able to turn a negative experience into something positive. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we never planned to take." Carmen was reading letters that had arrived from around the country, from veterans, from families who had experienced discrimination, from teachers who were using their story in their classrooms. One letter was from Victoria Ashford herself, who had written to apologize for her actions and to share that the experience had forced her to confront her own prejudices and begin the work of becoming a better person. As the family prepared for sleep, Miguel stood at the window looking out at the monuments illuminated against the night sky. Tomorrow, they would fly home to Miami on Atlantic Airways, with Sarah Davidson personally ensuring their trip was smooth and respectful. Their story had started with an attempt to reclaim a painful anniversary and create new memories. What they had found was something much more valuable, the knowledge that one voice raised in defense of justice could inspire countless others to do the same. The real victory wasn't in the apologies, the recognition, or the policy changes. The real victory was in the proof that dignity and courage were more powerful than prejudice and fear, and that ordinary families could change the world simply by refusing to accept injustice as normal. Miguel Rodriguez had gone to Washington, D.C. to find healing. Instead, he had found his calling as a voice for justice, dignity, and the belief that every person deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or circumstances. The quiet hero had finally learned to use his voice, and the world was listening. 1 year later, Gate C-14 at Miami International Airport displays a small plaque. This gate is dedicated to the principle that all passengers deserve dignity and respect. In honor of the Rodriguez family and all who stand up for justice, Sarah Davidson became the youngest regional manager in Atlantic Airways history and implemented anti-discrimination training that became the industry standard. Victoria Ashford completed diversity education and now works as a counselor helping others overcome prejudice. Diego Rodriguez's documentary about the incident won a National High School Journalism Award and helped him earn a full scholarship to study social justice media at Northwestern University. Sofia Rodriguez became a youth ambassador for military families and civil rights organizations. Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez established the Rodriguez Foundation, providing scholarships for children of military families and funding anti-discrimination education programs. Miguel continues to speak about dignity service and the power of standing up for what's right. Their story remains a reminder that heroes walk among us every day, that courage is contagious, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people choose between silence and justice. The legacy continues with every person who chooses to speak up, stand up, and never underestimate the power of treating others with dignity and respect. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories of courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Leave a comment below and tell us about a time when you witnessed someone standing up for dignity and justice. Remember, heroes don't wear capes. They wear everyday clothes and make extraordinary choices when faced with injustice. They speak up when others stay silent. They stand up when others look away. And they prove that one voice raised in defense of what's right can change everything. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us in building a world where every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Until next time, stay strong, stay just, and never forget that your voice matters.